Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can tell you what we're seeing out there in a broad range of companies, and it very much reflects the poll numbers. That sounds about right. I will tell you, there seems to be a tension between the risk and security folks saying prevent, and some of the innovation departments saying we need to experiment. And I think it's how you manage that tension. The my employees are going to access ChatGPT website from an internal computer, and what are we afraid of? It is more like an inbound risk, right? That's there whether you're going to use an LLM model internally to interact with your customers or not, right? So you think about it in those two dimensions. I will say what we've seen, a lot of sophisticated companies that want to use that balance, they've started off blocking ChatGPT. They've created a policy, much like their acceptable use policy for Gen AI. What are you allowed to use it for at the company? What are you not? They've also created training CBTs and added it to their employees' annual curriculum specific to the Gen AI policies. And then those that do allow do a manual reinforcement on their web security gateways. We see a lot of people using a pop-up click-through page to say you're accessing a Gen AI site. Here's a link to the policy. Please click yes to acknowledge you will maintain in compliance with the policy. And that's some of the behavior influencing behaviors, in addition to some of the controls around data and access that need to be in place. I think we've also seen that people are going to find a way to use it no matter what. There's plenty of ghost proxies in the network. We have the ChatGPT app, sure, that can limit the cutting and pasting, but paramount is having a policy to make it clear to your employees what's allowed versus what's not allowed if they are able to access those sites.
That's very interesting, and yeah, we'll definitely be touching on a lot of those themes in the conversation. Ganesh, I was wondering if I could get your reflections on what Jenai and Richard said there.
Yep, I totally agree with what Jenai and Richard said. That's kind of what we see as well. When I talk to customers and prospects and folks around the world, when I travel to these events, they are hesitant in terms of leveraging the LLMs in its full potential. And the immediate knee-jerk reaction is to ban it and then do a review of whether or not it should be authorized and so on. But like Rich mentioned, it's always about maintaining a balance between outright ban and having full-on access to, sharing everything. Perhaps enterprises can look at the different types of LLMs and different ways of leveraging these, rather than signing up for a paid external service of LLM. They could use open source models, and they could use their own internal data sets to train these models. So that way, they could circumvent some of the security and data privacy concerns that we talked about.
Yeah, definitely. And just before we kind of talk a bit more about those guardrails that could be put in place more in depth, perhaps Jenai, if I could come back to you, what kind of the most kind of impressive ways, if you like, of you're seeing large language models being integrated to improve business performance and also in cybersecurity teams at the moment?
Sure. So I'm seeing a couple of different areas. One is more around automated threat intelligence. So I think Ganesh had talked about this a bit, but there's a vast amount of information that you're able to leverage in order to be able to accurately predict a threat. I've seen a couple of things. One, in terms of the aggregation and analysis, but the second is the way that the analysts are using it to be able to pull in vulnerability data as an example, pull in more forensics data as an example, pull in public, So when it comes to automated threat intelligence, I've certainly seen some really cool things. But I'd like to give a shout out to the GRC industry, because you're starting to see LLMs being pulled into the GRC platforms. And anybody who's tried to configure these beasts, which tie into SOX, by the way, know full well that the ability to understand the controls that you're analyzing, to be able to determine whether or not they're effective in place. I've definitely seen LLMs in GRC platforms that I thought were pretty impressive.
That's really interesting. And Richard, a sort of same question to you. How are you sort of the most highlighted ways that you've seen them utilized?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really interesting. I'll answer it in kind of give you two perspectives. One, what do we see some of the early adopter companies using it for business value? And we really see people really gravitating towards getting value out of 4 different use cases. Right. Number one is customer engagement. Right. Your virtual customer service to shape responses based on whatever the product offering or documentation is, right? Advanced Q&A, it's essentially how do you make your lowest performing customer service, agents perform like your highest performing ones? And it acts as that virtual assistant. We think there's probably 60% uplift potential in the amount of volume you'll be able to service with high quality. And we see a lot of people starting to develop these. One of the most popular ones we see, especially with large enterprises, is coding and software, right? Translating code from legacy systems at scale, including automated assessment of the legacy landscape, explainability of old mainframe code, and the ability to rewrite that. There's been a lot of actual production experiments going on here, whether Microsoft's Copilot, whether some of the more proprietary models like StarCoder, where you can train the model using your own code, which you can't do for Copilot. So we're finding most people have different use cases and are using more than one of these. But really, we've seen real 50% plus productivity gains for developers utilizing these Copilot type engagement. It's an interesting observation there is your most talented developers get a huge uplift. It actually slows down and lowers the quality of your lower tenured developers because they don't understand what's coming back at them. So to get the lift, you have to do some upskilling and training. I'd say the third of four use case we see really being actually utilized is the virtual expert. The providing the always on, deeply technical support bot trained on your proprietary knowledge base to be able to interact either companies using their internal knowledge base to do that and making it easier for consultants and others, as well as the large companies trying to do that as search. And then I'd say the fourth use case we see really gaining traction and delivering value is content generation. Personalized M&S content tailored to a personalized client profile, taking all their history, personalized nudges, alternatives for A/B testing. We've seen some interesting things like automated RFP responses coming out of there. So I'd say those are the four we're seeing real business value being generated out of. There's been a hesitancy to do super risky things so far. And then to the how do we see it in security, the GRC example is great. I think the two biggest use cases we see now are some of that risk analysis of vulnerability data, control data. I mean, I think if you can at the simplest level picture, let's assume your GRC is full of accurate data and you have all the right things in there and the right modules to be able to ask it human language questions, right? And have it start to learn and do some predictive. That's super powerful because there's entire teams of GRC system engineers who have been trying to answer some of these same questions for years and years. So there's a lot of promise there. And I think in the security operations space, we've seen, Google Chronicle, we've seen what they've done with the Mandiant purchase and trying to make these Gen AI enabled services around security logging data. We're seeing a lot of that for people who are starting to build their own LLM models. Their internal security teams are starting to find use cases to be able to dump their log data in and start asking human readable questions of, we have this piece of intel, which of my systems are vulnerable, right? Without having to go query 15 different databases. Now, there's a lot of dependencies on all this working on that you have clean data and it's all in one place. And that usually means it's in the cloud to be able to take advantage of the real processing power you're going to need to do this. But it is early days and things are changing very, very quickly. So there is some of it that we are in a hype cycle, but there is real value being generated.
Yeah, that's really, really encouraging to hear and great to hear those types of examples. And yeah, it really emphasizes the importance of finding ways to utilize large language models safely and securely in business and cybersecurity as well. So just to touch on the Jenai, you've already mentioned the issue of governance and Richard as well, governance and risk in this context. So I just wanted to ask you, do you believe large language models have to some extent reignited conversations around data governance? And yeah, if you could expand on how important that aspect is in this conversation.
Sure. In terms of most companies, when you look at data governance and true data governance, they're, do a pretty good job, or at least attempt to, around, say, personally identifiable information. And that's it. Right. So there's no real analysis around critical information throughout the company, how it's used, how you're allowed to speak about this data, what you're allowed to communicate outside of the company, and how. And that goes back to the role-based conversations, understanding that when I look at this data, if I'm going to ask a question of the LLM, I can ask the LLM the question this way, but do not ask it this way. Right? So there's a way to get an answer through something without exposing confidential information. And in order to train people to do that, you have to train them using their language and their role. Otherwise, it's simply not going to make sense. So it goes to data governance, and then, just good old fashioned data classification. Most people don't understand the controls that that are required around different types of information and how it's classified. And so because organizations tend not to do an effective job at that, then it's very difficult to then say, what these are the controls, and then this is how you're allowed to speak with about the data, when it comes to the LLM. So the long story short of it is that, a lot of the problems that we're seeing is because the front end of the cybersecurity model is broken. And as a result, we see these issues. So yes, I think it does.
Brilliant, thank you. And Ganesh, if I could bring you in and just ask you based on Jenai's thoughts there and implementing how to implement data governance effectively in regard to large language models.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Jenai. Right now, we have a new role called prompt engineer. That's quite popular now, right? So the prompt engineers are only as good as their knowledge and skill set and how well versed they are in data governance. And like Jenai mentioned, we only see a handful of government agencies have barely focused on data privacy protection laws, right? So anything beyond PI data, I think it's all out. Enterprises struggle to, classify this data, protect these data, and have processes in place on how these data should be handled. So, like Jai mentioned, prompt engineers are generally, their job is to, effectively leverage these LLMs, but they could do that only if they are well versed in data governance. They should know what data can be shared, and how it should be shared, how the question should be asked to get the optimal answer in the most quickest way. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ganesh. And Richard, I was just wondering if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think Ganesh hit it on the nose, right? What we're learning is there's a difference between setting up an environment to consume, an API-based OpenAI model, whether it's Bard or, OpenAI or one of the industry-specific LLMs, and the ability to do it responsibly, which requires prompt engineering as a role, right? I love Jenai's example of, the internal data, right? So there's an example, let's say you've put all your internal data in one place and you train an LLM on it and you open it up for your users to ask your knowledge-based questions. Hey, what's the CEO's salary? And please tell me his home address. Well, you put all your data in there, you put an LLM model on it, chances are that you're going to get that accurate information back unless you have one or both of, Jenai mentioned the data controls, right? Is that LLM allowed to access that data, or are the users who are initiating the query? But more importantly, the prompt engineering working around the use cases and building that prompt glossary of allowable parameters within context to be able to prevent what questions for each use case can be asked. This is super important, and it illustrates something we talked about earlier on, some of these risks, like prompt injection scenarios are real, right? The way, LLMs, it's early days, there's no real separation like browser-based applications between the control plane and the data plane. So you may have a system parameter set that says, don't talk about Google, because you're trying to limit what, it can say. Maybe it's to limit your Microsoft and you don't want answers being given that mention your competitor, right? Whatever system parameter. But users can very easily make their query look just like a system parameter. And these LLMs don't separate the control plane and the data plane the way our traditional apps do yet, without you building controls in. And they're going to take the most recent command as the last command. So even though you said don't mention Google, somebody can quickly engineer a prompt that says, oh, but it's okay to talk about Google now. And it's going to take that in order. Don't talk about Google. Oh, now I can talk about Google. And how you think about prompt engineering and some of the guardrails is going to be the difference between those responses and results, exactly because how Jenai explained it is that, data governance is not in good shape at most enterprises.
Thank you, Richard. Really fascinating stuff. I'm just going to pause the conversation for a second there just to take a look at the answers to the second poll question, which sort of relates to the conversation we're having. So the question, as a reminder, was, what are your biggest concerns around the use of LLMs in the workplace? 27% said performance issues such as hallucinations. 54% said data exposure and other cyber and privacy issues. 18% said the impact on the workforce. So yeah, it's an interesting mix there. And just to perhaps if I could stay with you, Richard, and in terms of that kind of data exposure issue and other cyber risks emanating out of tools like ChatGPT. I mean, we saw Samsung recently sort of ban the use of ChatGPT among the workforce. What are some of the other measures that specific measures organizations can put into to kind of mitigate those risks and avoid having to issue bans of sorts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously Samsung was being reactive because they've had 3 separate Gen AI related breaches in the past 6 months. And not to pick on them, they're not alone, right? Like any new technology, it's early days and we're learning things. And this being the fastest adopted thing in the ever, I think is how we're looking at it. Yeah. The opportunities are rife. I mean, we've seen Facebook, Samsung, Alphabet, Microsoft, Fluke, GitHub, right? I mean, big companies who know how to secure things are being impacted. I think, in the data loss, we're tracking metrics that greater than 10% of data pasted into ChatGPT is considered proprietary confidential data by enterprises, right? So it's happening, right? And I think this is back to how you think about the risk as an inbound risk, meaning our employees are using ChatGPT, right? Your traditional data security controls should be in the mix here. It should be able to intercept and limit the data being uploaded. It should recognize whether you're uploading code. It should recognize whether you're uploading tagged data, right? You're making an assumption that you have data loss controls and they work, but that's required to control some of this. The second dimension is you're using LLMs and you've probably got some proprietary data set of your own that you're training it on. And you're probably using some of the compute power from some, protected version in a secure enclave of a large scale commercial LLM. And how you control what data is inside versus outside the firewall and what is being used for training requires some sophistication, whether it's PII scrubbers in the mix of the prompt, which should be new controls needed, or whether it's simply what does your existing cloud security look like so you can understand entire pieces of data from your training set cannot even mistakenly be transferred up to a large commercial LLM's data set. I would say, though, while we do think this data leakage is real in that second scenario, it's a hugely sophisticated attacker to be able to extract proprietary data and assume there's no hallucinations and assume it's accurate from these commercial large language models. So I think that one's being a little overblown. You've got to have enough references to get it to some level of memorization. You've got to have enough of the secret or the format of the secret to match the pattern to be able to say it's accurate. Like you were saying, give me so-and-so's social security number, right? How do you know it didn't just get made up? And you've got to be able to determine there's no hallucinations in it. So I think it is a risk, but more so from how do you control when you're standing up internal LLM stuff of your proprietary data going out to be leveraged for learning.
Thank you so much, Richard. Just to quickly mention to the audience, I've set the third and final poll question live now, which is, do you believe LLMs will have a net positive impact on cybersecurity in the long term? So yeah, please do send in your responses again. So Jenna, I saw you nodding to quite a lot of that. I was wondering if you had any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a concept called explainability when it comes to artificially intelligent systems that says that at the end of the day, you need to be able to explain all of your decisions in a way that a layperson can understand. And a lot of the LLMs we're using to make decisions upon and get integrated into a lot of getting integrated into critical business processes in a way we don't yet understand. And so I think one of the guardrails is that if we train and have frameworks around explainability that says, hey, we are using AI in this way, and be able to explain how you're using it and how it's being ingested and how it's being handled and who are all the people who are making decisions based, if you define all of the explainability requirements around it, that is also a guardrail.
Definitely. Thank you, Janaya. Ganesh, if I get your thoughts on that, and also the kind of the issues that's been touched upon, like hallucinations and drifting, and what measures perhaps can be put in place to kind of reduce the risk of those happening.
Yes. So the poll answer was perfect. Like, folks don't consider hallucination and drifting as a bigger problem. So it's the data security and data privacy that's a bigger problem, because I mean, the worst case scenario, a hallucination or drifting is just going to get your answer delayed to you, right? But whereas imagine an office stamp accidentally uploading an unpatented architectural diagram in the hope that an LLM will improve on it, right? So nobody knows. That touches on Jenna's point. Like, we can have explainability on how we use LLMs, when, where, and who uses LLM. But there's a fundamental problem that even vendors cannot completely explain how LLMs arrive at a certain problem, right? So that's where the scary part is. So when you pose a question to an LLM, it obviously answers. From a technical perspective, we all can explain how it is designed, in what data set it's trained on, what parameters it's trained on. So we can give you all the numbers and statistics and even the architecture of how it is trained. But that's not the end of it. So when it answers, there's something that happens within its artificial intelligence, in the sense, I mean, LLMs have come up to a point where we have to come up with a new term, AGI, to differentiate what is artificial intelligence, something that was like simply understood until a few months back. Now we have to come up with a completely new point to drive the idea that nope, LLMs aren't exactly complete AI, and it's definitely nowhere near AGI the way they are designed on. So yeah, in that sense, hallucination and drifting aren't really a problem that we have to think too much about at this point of time, because we have bigger problems in place to tackle. And one of those problems are the fact that we, or the vendors who design these LLMs, even they cannot explain how and why it answers certain questions the way it answers.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. And yeah, there's a few more issues I want to sort of get through to in this discussion. But Jenna, if I could come back to you, what are kind of advice or recommended response actions do you have for organizations if confidential data has been exposed and consumed by a public or unauthorized large language model?
Sure. It's a tough position to be in. So first and foremost, you execute your incident response process. So you've got to get to containment and isolation as rapidly as humanly possible. So you got to validate the data. Where did it come from? And make sure. So as an example, if you have an API connection into an LLM, do you need to disable the API keys, revoke any permissions, isolate all of the affected systems that are that could potentially be involved, so that you can at least contain. You've got to be able to understand what data was actually exposed in this system. And you immediately have to start engaging your legal department because there's several things that you're going to potentially have to do. First and foremost, you need to reach out to the vendor, to the LLM vendor, to be able to try and get the data out of the system. And so that doesn't always work. So you basically you would submit a data deletion request. Sometimes that doesn't work, and you need to issue a cease and desist. And sometimes that doesn't work, and you need to execute legal action. But you need to make sure, and then you need to go through all of the other steps that you do when it comes to data leakage. Was this information consumed by any other downstream systems? Was it crawled by the internet? Right? So now you've got to go to all of the different search engines and do the exact same process that I mentioned there. But the first and foremost is you've got to figure out, validate the data, validate how the data got in, and then you need to be able to contain that as rapidly as possible, and then get in contact with the LLM and see if you can get the data taken out. You're probably not going to be very successful with a lot of it. And the reason is that even if you got the data taken down, the model's already been trained on it. So you're at a loss. So dealing with data that's been exposed, and especially in a public LLM, is far worse a lot of times than the data being exposed naked out on the internet.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And Richard, if I could throw the same question to you.
Yeah, there's a saying my wife says to me a lot is you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. I think a lot of this is if your data is being used to train a model, one, do you even know about it, right? We're already seeing lawsuits from people that hold IP around images, the Getty images, specifically that they believe was used to train some of these image producing models, right? So some of it is, how do you know if your data is being used to train a model that's now being used to commercialize something else? To the earlier point, if you do find yourself in the position of a Samsung or what happened earlier, it is very much having a well-rehearsed crisis response muscle to flex. But I think the real answer is, how do you shift left into prevention? How do you do a real prioritized use case-based risk assessment to understand what the use cases are, what the controls are needed, and how those controls are implemented? I mean, things as simple as, we talked a little bit about hallucinations. There's no silver bullet to be able to solve for that, right? Data loss is just one thing. I don't think that's necessarily the biggest risk. I think it's probably top 5, but when accuracy oftentimes does matter. Some of the biggest use cases being bandied around are in the financial services vertical, right? We're going to use Gen AI to make loan decisions, credit decisions, financial advisor decisions, right? So accuracy, explainability, hallucinations matters a whole heck of a lot, right? To get the industry comfortable with doing this. And knowing that there's no silver bullet is about subject matter experts, right? And there's going to be trade-offs when you configure these models between safety and the sharpness of answers. I think it's, it can be safe or dumb, or it can be smart and dangerous, right? And having a risk taxonomy and a risk framework as you think about your enterprise's usage that takes into account the risks of impaired fairness, the risks of IP infringement, the risk of the data privacy and the quality, the loss, malicious use, security threats, performance and explainability, or strategic risk with regulatory and societal and reputational risk factors. I think it's interesting timing that we had this webinar, considering yesterday most of our tech titans were on Capitol Hill, and in a show of hands in the Senate, they voted that the government should take a hand in regulating AI in the public use. The European Union has already put forth laws maintaining that you be able to prove testing and how you configured your model and how you protect it against these things. So I do think, if you lose some internal data doing it, it's a failure of internal controls, and it's just like losing data any other way. You have an incident response playbook, you have crisis management, you've rehearsed. This is all hopefully true for anyone that goes through it. But yeah, you can't untrain a model once it's out there, and I think the litany of lawsuits and legal opinions is far from settled. And there's far from a book of case law on how this is all going to play out so far.
Yeah, I think it's going to be many years of sort of conversations we're going to have to kind of thrash out a lot of these, where we stand on these points. We've just had a very interesting question come through from the audience regarding education in regard to AI. So the question is, in terms of formal education and certification with regard to AI, where should support staff focus their education? Data science, data analytics, or more AI-centric education? It would seem to me that data science, data analytics, law, and AI intersect and are tied together when it comes to AI as a whole. Ganesh, could I get your thoughts on that to start with?
Yes, that's a very good question. So AI-centric education would probably focus more on the technical aspects of how these large language models or AI work. But like I said, these LLMs are still in its infancy. And as Rich mentioned, there's a legal side to it as to whether or not is it legal. And there's also litany, like you said, lawsuits, and we'll wait for the courts to answer, and we'll wait. But there's a ethical side to this problem. So imagine a freelancer creating a painting or writing a book and posting it in a site like DeviantArt or in a place where he gives 10 pages a sample. Now you have a model that goes and gets trained on it. Even if it is watermarked, these AIs can remove the watermark in no time, right? So imagine a model getting trained on it and coming up with a painting that's 10 times better than what that person has done, right? So the poll answer somebody gave earlier, it's a very good answer. Like it's not even about job loss. It's about how much data generated by AI is going to pollute the World Wide Web. So we already have problems in classifying which is human-generated data, and now with these LLMs and models coming up with all kinds of data, I think like the government at some point has to intervene and say, just like the cookie policy, it has to say like any AI-generated information should have a label that says it is generated by AI. So that's probably where. So from that perspective, to answer this question, I would suggest them to focus more on data science and data analytics, because that's the fundamental. You could always learn about AI as a technology anytime, but how do you hold that power and how do you wield that capability? For that, you would actually have to focus more on data science and data analytics. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Ganesh. That's really interesting. And Janai, where do you stand on that kind of formal education piece?
Oh, I'm right there with Ganesh. So understand the fundamentals. I believe that it should be taught in grade school, to be quite honest. I think that fundamental and STEM education, young kids should be understanding the fundamentals of data, and they should be understanding the fundamentals of artificial intelligence. So I absolutely agree. And not only that, but you already nailed it. You use data outside of AI. You don't need an algorithm to solve all your problems, so understanding the fundamentals will help you in many other ways outside of artificial intelligence. So I agree.
Thank you. And Richard, finally on that.
Yeah, I'll maybe I'll cover a different aspect of it. Like what could a security professional or an IT professional do right just to start to educate themselves? I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that same question. As I've had hundreds of conversations with clients. I've really delved deep into the folks who are building these models. It's a great focus of my time. A friend of mine who's the ex-CISO at Robinhood, who's semi-retired these days. About 2 months ago, he and I were banding about what is this LLM thing? How does he get deep? And he made it his job from 9 to 5 to learn about LLMs, AI, and what the threats are. And he decomposed it about 3 weeks ago into a blog post, which is about a 30-minute read. It's a great place to start. It follows his educational journey of a lifelong IT company founder, product founder, big company CISO, and his journey to how did I learn about LLMs, deployments, what are the threats around prompt injection. His blog post is on medium.com. His name's Caleb Sima, S-I-M-A. It's a great place to start if you're wondering how do I start to just get a layman's idea of the concept so I can decide, where do I really want to dig in. 30 minutes of your time will teach you a lot, as he's just done a community service and documenting his journey at how he answered that same question of how do I get smart on the topic.
We actually teach a class in artificial intelligence. So all of the students that go through all of our programs all get trained on AI. And we actually train it through the lens of explainability, because at the end of the day, especially if you're going into GRC instead of cybersecurity, you're not going to be able to decompose these models. That's not practical. But you can force people to explain every aspect. And there's actually ICO has some great guidance in terms of the different types of explainability, the principles of an explainable system. But if you start understanding AI through the lens of explainability, oftentimes it gives a really good baseline to understand some of the fundamentals of AI.
That's really helpful advice, guys. Thank you so much for that. We're close to the end of the session now, so I just want to take a quick look at the responses to the final poll question, which was: do you believe LLMs will have a net positive impact on cybersecurity in the long term? So 50% said yes, they believe it will outweigh the risks once we have the appropriate guardrails in place. 37% said no, it offers too many opportunities for malicious activity, and 12% said it's too early to say, so sitting on the fence to some extent. So I was thinking I might come to each of our panelists in turn, just get your final kind of thoughts on that poll question and the issue of utilizing LLMs in enterprises more generally. Ganesh, if I could start with you, perhaps.
Yep, I agree with the poll responses. 50% of them mentioned that the benefits outweigh the risks. And like Janai mentioned, if we take all the right steps and if we classify the data, come up with process in place on how we can leverage these LLMs, I think the enterprises will be pretty safe in terms of it. And also these models are in infancy, like I said. So we will see more development, not only in malicious activity, but vendors are investing, and there's like hundreds of AI startups popping up everywhere, and everybody is trying to, get the best out of these large language model as a technology. So there will definitely be growth, and we will see some really useful and beneficial things coming out of LLMs. And that is, again, like, despite us waiting for the verdict out from a legal perspective, from an ethical perspective, beyond all of that, there's still good benefits. And I'm happy that our audience have decided that 50% of them say like it's going to outweigh the risks.
Yeah, nice and positive that. And Richard, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's concerns around people aren't going to do it responsibly, right? Because there's no law yet forcing them to do things responsibly and worry about bias and risk and explainability and disclosure of when it's being used. That's a worry. I think, when we think about how to make best use, right, it is going to enable just the complete reimagining of things that weren't possible before, right? It's a super powerful tool. It's going to unlock things in marketing and commercial, the fundamental way we do things. But I think the Gen AI models are only part of the value unlock. And it's really going to be about, having a well-structured and adaptable data infrastructure, right? The risk of trying to do it without that, of getting data into the cloud. So you'll have the bandwidth and the tools to be able to use it. And there's a risk that people don't understand, what MLOps is and how to scale it to maintain the impact, right? They're going to have to build platforms and tools to manage AI in a manner that does reduce risk, ensures fidelity, and continuously improves and maintains the models that are in production. I think lastly, there's going to be new capabilities and talent required along with massive change management. This is no doubt in the next 10 years, this is going to massively shift the scope of several major job families: customer care, research, communications, and is going to require real change management at the front lines to be able to achieve the impact you want without the downside risks that we're afraid of in the poll. I mean, just like any new technology, and this is new technology, there's going to be a significant historical challenge in that last mile adoption to be able to get the impact.
Yeah, quite a revolutionary thing, really, isn't it? And Jenna, final thoughts to you.
Sure. I, like everybody else, am really, I'm happy about the 50% that think that there's, that this is of significant value. I loathe ceding ground to adversaries, and adversaries are becoming expert at being able to use and manipulate these technologies at scale. So the idea that we're going to poo-poo it and that we're not going to pay attention, or that we're is not feasible, because the underground is weaponizing this in ways that we haven't yet predicted. So one is we've got to get our arms wrapped around it, but the opportunities, just like Rich and Ganesh were saying, are limitless. And all of the things that were drudgery work in security operations, cybersecurity, and GRC are going to be completely changed. People being able to, especially junior people, get up to speed on technologies and productive rapidly is going to change. So and not only that, but it also gives the opportunity, and I'll end on this one, the future of our workforce is predicated on our ability to pivot our job skills. And these large language models give people just a leg up on the ability to pivot from one job position to the other, which is going to be key to thrive in this future world. So thank you.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a really good positive way to end as well. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. It really flew by this session, and so much more I think we could talk about. But a massive thank you to Ganesh, Jenna, and Richard for your insights and time this afternoon. Really appreciate it. Big thank you as well to Manage Engine for sponsoring this webinar. For details on upcoming Info Security Magazine webinars, please see our website. And please remember, you can rate this session, tell us what you liked or areas you'd like us to perhaps improve upon in the future. But with that, thank you for listening, and this session is now ending. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.